kindly introduce me, my name is Lana Roddy, and I'm going to be the moderator for today's session. Just a few gentle, quick reminders just to make sure those microphones are off. And as Phil mentioned, if you have any questions at any time during the presentations, go ahead and write it for me in the chat box. I'm going to be monitoring the chat box and collating all those questions, and our presenters will answer for those questions for you at the designated Q&A timings. And also, as Phil mentioned, if you want more information or if you want links to some of the programs and apps that we use during these presentations, you can check it out on our website. In today's session, we are focusing on shifting to an e-learning. So Ms. Francesca Jones is going to kick us off in today's session, speaking about the 7 affordances of e-learning and really focusing on the theory and the practices behind it. Mr. Wakil Khan is going to continue on in a similar light, speaking about the 7 affordances of e-learning, but this time how to take those theories and actually use them inside the classroom. So we're talking about the practice and the application. At this point in the session, we're going to stop for a quick Q&A session. When we come back, Richard Naish is going to kick us off with speaking about the constraints and considerations of e-learning. And our final session for today is with Peter Marciniak about learning objectives and lesson stagings. So without further ado, Fran, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lana. Good afternoon, good evening, and perhaps very, very late evening, depending on where you are joining us from today. My name is Francesca Jones, and I have been an ESL teacher for 12 years now, and this is my 3rd year as a doctoral student in e-learning and higher education. So it is my pleasure to speak to you today about shifting to an e-learning paradigm. So parents, teachers, students around the world are expressing their frustrations and the challenges that they are facing with this abrupt transition to e-learning. And while I find it very therapeutic to visit these Facebook pleasure to speak and laugh today about the comical aspects about shifting to an e-learning. I also am really excited about parents, teachers, students around the world the opportunities are expressing their frustrations and challenges. And so when I was thinking about why it is that we're not all on the same page regarding and while I find it very therapeutic, one of our main pleasures to laugh about shifting to. I also am really excited about parents, teachers, students around the world are expressing their frustrations and challenges about why it is that we're not all on the same page. And while I find it very therapeutic, one of our main pleasures to laugh about I also now. But most importantly, we need to make sure that we make this shift because it's our duty, it's our responsibility as educators to ensure that we are meeting the needs of today's learners, today's workforce, and today's world. So just to exemplify for you what I mean when I say today's learners, I thought I'd show you our toys and their toys. Or for example, our internet. I don't know about you, but this is how I used to get access to the internet and their internet. And this is a symbol that they all recognize and look for frantically wherever they go. So we as educators need to make sure we're teaching to the right side of the screen and not the left side of the screen. So as educators, that means that we need to reframe our thinking. It means we need to understand e-learning so that we can maximize all of its benefits. And it means that we have an opportunity to really expand our teaching repertoires. So we don't have to forget everything we know about teaching. We just need to expand and build upon those skills. So before my colleagues and I talk to you about different areas of e-learning, I just want to remind you that this is a process. And so we have to be patient with ourselves, and we have to be patient with our learners. And secondly, an important part of this shift is that we really need to research and educate ourselves and learn from the experts that really know about e-learning. And so as a doctoral student of e-learning, I've had the opportunity to read a lot. And my professors at the University of Illinois, Dr. Cope and Dr. Affordances, have determined these 7 key principles or affordances of e-learning that really serve as a great foundation in setting up this e-learning paradigm or perspective. And so I want to go through each one of these with you. And I want you to keep in mind that they're termed affordances because they emphasize the opportunities that e-learning has to offer. And I will do this by contrasting traditional education with e-learning, again, just to emphasize the doors that e-learning opens for us. So let's start with affordance number 1, ubiquitous learning, or learning anytime, anywhere. In traditional learning, we are learning within the 4 walls of a classroom, and we're learning on a schedule with timetables and bells. Through e-learning, however, we have opportunities for learning to take place synchronously, so at the same time, or asynchronously. And so for our learners, that means that they learn how to become more independent, more responsible. They learn interpersonal computing skills. They're learning how to communicate and navigate in an online environment. And as I said, they become more accountable because they can't use excuses anymore, like the dog ate their homework or they forgot their homework at home. And for us as educators, it means that we gain more transparency. We gain more surveillance over their work. We can really see everything that they're doing. So this is a great opportunity for us as educators. Affordance number 2 is active knowledge making or designing meanings. In traditional education, the student is a knowledge consumer. So they can't talk while the teacher is talking. They have to take notes, they have to pay attention and save as much information in their minds as possible. They also, as you can see from this picture, don't get to talk whenever they want to talk. They don't get to contribute all the time. They have to raise their hand and take turns contributing. And so they're limited in the amount that they can contribute to the class. And because they're receiving all of this information, we really focus on assessing their ability to save information in their minds. In e-learning, however, the student has the opportunity to be a knowledge producer. And so we can actually assess their work and what they produce instead of focusing on how much information they can memorize. This also allows for all the students to participate actively at the same time. They don't have to raise their hand to participate. All students can be writing and contributing their thoughts at the same time, which is great for us and for our learners. Affordance number 3 is multimodal meaning. Text, image, sound, data, video. So in traditional learning, we were really limited to the forms that we could use to produce meaning. We focused on writing and essays. And we also had limited forms of receiving information, such as the textbook. However, through e-learning, we have access to diverse forms of making meaning. Also, as English teachers, you can focus on multiliteracy. So not just reading and writing, but you can focus on developing those really important digital literacy skills that are needed in the world today, that are needed in the workforce today. Affordance number 4 is recursive feedback or formative assessment. So in traditional learning, there was this focus on the final exam or the final report card. And as you can see in this picture, there's one teacher giving feedback to a whole class of students, which is a really heavy burden I'm sure you can all relate to. However, through e-learning, we have more opportunities to do formative assessment, to focus on continuous assessment. And so we can do that through the assistance of machine-mediated assessment. I'm sure you're familiar with apps like Quizzes, Kahoot, Quizlet that give our learners feedback right away. So that alleviates us and some of the pressure off of us from giving feedback. And we can also do things like peer and self-assessment. And this is really great for our learners because they become more aware of their learning outcomes as they're giving each other feedback. Affordance number 5 is collaborative intelligence, knowledge you can reach for and use. So as you can see from this picture, in traditional learning, we really focused on individual intelligence. And this connects with that idea of them just memorizing and storing information in their brains. And that's how we assess them. However, the learners also only show their work to the teacher. And so again, this is pressure only on the teacher. And collaboration also has to be somewhat limited for classroom management purposes. Otherwise, students would be just talking and all over the place. Through e-learning, we have an opportunity to really emphasize collective intelligence and really emphasize our ability to access the infinite information that is available to us in the world today. And the learner also shares their work to a learning community. And this is one of my favorite benefits because you will see that once learners know that they're going to share their work to a place where their peers will see it, the quality of their work really increases. And we also have more collaborative opportunities through things such as discussion boards. Affordance number 6 is metacognition, which is thinking about thinking. So traditionally, when we give students tasks, we give them checklists and outlines, and they just go through and do things procedurally. We focus on what they think, we focus on what they know, but we don't really take it beyond that. And through e-learning, we have opportunities to take it beyond that and really encourage the learner to reflect about their work. So we can do this through things like mind mapping, as you can see in this picture. We can do that through written reflections, recorded audio reflections, and we can also do that by utilizing rubrics and ensuring that our students know what criteria we are expecting of them. That way they can really think about this criteria as they're creating their work. So really thinking about their thinking. And these are the types of skills that we need learners to go on and take to the workforce to be innovative in the future. The last affordance, affordance number 7, is differentiated learning. So each according to their interest and need. This is one of my favorite ones. In traditional learning, education is very teacher-centered. The students are doing the same work at the same time, taking the same tests, and this is really unrealistic for them to be completing tasks all at the same time and following this precise schedule. Through e-learning, we really have the opportunity to make learning more learner-centered, and we have increased opportunities to differentiate instruction. So when it comes to pace, the students that need more time to complete their work can do that without feeling pressured or rushed. And those students that achieve everything they need to do quickly and progress quickly don't need to feel like they're being held back by the other students as well. Because you're in a learning environment and each student can go according to their pace, everyone is is learning through a much better experience that makes them feel better as well. And according to their own interest. So if you're an English teacher, you could focus, let's say, on a specific grammar point or a specific vocab group, but then allow the students to use that point in relation to something that interests them. So you could use something like modal verbs, for example, and have the students use that to talk about whatever topic interests them, but they're still utilizing that grammar point. So that's it. Those are the 7 affordances. I know that I've gone through them quite quickly, but fortunately, my colleague, Mr. Wakil, is going to elaborate on them a little bit more and talk to you about how you can actually apply them. So I hope that this has got you thinking. I hope you learned something new today, and I really appreciate your time and attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fran. Thank you very much. Yeah, I really like that, and I'm sure there's going to be quite a few questions coming your way when we get to the Q&A, thinking about thinking and differentiated learning. And just on a side note, when you go to the website and you look at Francesca's presentation, you might notice with all the graphics at the beginning, it was designed by someone called Jones H. And secretly, I found out that that was her daughter. So those graphics that you see in her presentation are designed by Fran's daughter. So well done. An e-learning family. So, right, let's move on and continuing on with the same concept of the 7 affordances. Wakil is now going to elaborate on these with some more practical examples for you. So over to you, Wakil.
Hello, everybody. Brilliant. Hello. Hi. So my name is Wakil, and I'm going to follow on from Francesca. Previously, I worked as an art director and a designer in the UK and across the UAE. I've been teaching in the vocational sector and at foundation level for almost 10 years now. And my experience in design communication has allowed me to combine many of my design principles within the online pedagogy. So let me just share my screen. Okay, so the aim of my session will be to show you how you can implement the 7 affordance strategies that Francesca just mentioned into your online pedagogy. So actual practical tasks. And we're going to try to do this using 10 task-based activities covering the 7 affordances. And hopefully by the end of this, you'll be able to take some practical ideas and knowledge that we have shared today. So let me just make this a little bit smaller. Okay, so that's going to be the plan. So what we'll do is start with affordance number 1, which is the ubiquitous learning. So this whole idea of anytime and anywhere. So this affordance looks at making it easier for learners to access content on any computer or mobile device, whether they're online or whether they're offline. So the key focus, what I'm going to look at is the synchronous sessions and the asynchronous sessions, and look at tasks around those 2 areas. So synchronous sessions. We're all kind of familiar with this kind of setup where you have the teacher in a face-to-face conference using applications like Zoom, where she can see the students, and the learners can also see the teacher, and this is your typical synchronous session. We use applications like Zoom, which we are doing now, and there's lots of other free applications which are around, like Google Meet. And the one that we use at our institution at the moment is something like Blackboard. All of these are great tools to access that information. So although not a complete substitute for that classroom face-to-face, when teachers actively interact and engage with students in this face-to-face online setting, the class develops as that learning community. It develops intellectual and personal bonds with the teacher and one another. So that nurturing that human link between the teacher is vitally important, and also to the student and that learning environment. So this synchronous session is important. So task 1, it's an easy task, the first one. It's to post a timetable. to make sure that your learner knows when you will be online. So something as simple as this, where it shows the time, the day, the duration, when you're available for that face-to-face online session. This obviously is a fixed time. So being that it's fixed, you use that time wisely to get to know your students and plan your interactions in advance. So for example, if you have a large, maybe a 30 to 40 minute session, you would do a 20-minute face-to-face, build some connections, do your activities, and maybe use the rest of the session where you can do some other online activities. Over the term and over the course, you might find that there's many, many sessions. So try to use consistent naming conventions so that it's easy for them to find those lessons. For example, if you could use something like this as an example, maybe you have a weekday, a week number, a day number, the period, and maybe some kind of reference, so students always know where your sessions are and they don't get lost. So to try to make it easy for them to find. So that's task number 1. Task number 2, record your sessions. So it's important, and that's one of the advantages of online, is that not only can you have that one-to-one on your platform, but being able to record those sessions and have the learners have access to that information. Learners can then gain any missed information and also maybe reinforce any areas that they didn't understand while you were doing the synchronous session. And sometimes during that session, what you might do is you might plan one idea. However, over the lesson, you may cover some other areas as well. So one thing I find in my practice is that naming your recordings to match the lesson is vitally important. Because if you have a list of many lessons, it becomes almost counterintuitive for the student to go and find that information or find that work. So staying organized is very, very important. What you don't want is your learners to waste cognitive energy looking for the lesson, otherwise they will have very little energy left to actually do the work. So this is anytime, anywhere. So the idea that students can always access that information whenever they're free, whether they're anytime, anywhere, on any device as well. Okay, so that's task number 2. Task number 3, make files downloadable. Sounds easy, but very, very important. Some students have limited access to the internet, and so therefore making work available for them offline is going to make a huge difference. So learners should be able to access that information on their devices. And if you don't have the access, sometimes maybe you don't have the full privilege for Zoom, or you don't have a fancy sort of learning management system like Blackboard or Collaborate, you can use free cloud-based drives to upload and share the links for your learners. So once you've recorded your session, you upload them and then they can share that link, and then they have that access to download that information. Another sort of tip here as well, another big thing to do is also to convert your documents into PDF format. Your learners may not have the software available. Maybe they don't have Microsoft Office, or they don't have that one application that you use. And so saving your files as PDF files, it's a universal program, it's a universal format. Anybody can open on any platform and on most devices like mobiles and iPads. So always try to convert PDF and always try to reduce your file sizes wherever possible. So task 3, download your synchronous sessions. So task 4, create links to other resources. So create a folder containing different links to resources like YouTube videos, online articles, books, surveys, games, and quizzes. So this is a rich area of resource around the internet, and so much information is out there. So this will help inspire new perspectives for your learners, it will save time for the teacher, and also it will reinforce your concepts through alternative mediums. Okay, so task 4, you create a link folder with all your other resources, for other resources. Okay, so affordance number 2, active knowledge making. So the idea of designing meanings. So what we're going to look at here is to convert learners from knowledge consumers into knowledge producers. We're going to look at active engagement tasks and student-centered tasks. So with the advent of so many different devices, learners now have access to vast amounts of information. You should be able to encourage the students to make new connections between each other and between lots of different types of information. So in order to do this, you will also try to encourage them to contribute new meanings and ideas to the group and to that learning environment. After you've completed the first 4 or 5, after the first 5 tasks, you will see that you've given the students already quite a lot of access to a variety of different resources like videos now, and images and PDFs and web links and so on. So what you want to try to do is encourage the learners to contribute the ideas from their perspective and make connections between key points between them, and also challenge them with a mix of easy tasks and difficult tasks. So the task for number 5 is to have a task to contribute knowledge. Encourage your students to message on forums. So a forum is a great place for discussion. So I have an example here where you have 3 different examples, maybe an induction forum where students try to get to know each other, an online setup where students are trying to get their environment set up so that they don't get left behind, and coursework forums. So task-related, queries and questions and answers, so that they can be on task as well. So if you don't have the facility for forums, you can always use email threads, or you can always use WhatsApp groups. And in this, the idea behind this is that this becomes a student-centered asynchronous conversation between your learners. And it could be also a synchronous session with the teacher-led synchronous session in an activity for the whole group. So forums is kind of like a good conversation, organic conversation builder. Another knowledge producing task, or contributing task, is mind mapping tools. There's many mind mapping tools. The 2 that I think are really great are Coggle and MindUp. Both of these encourage the student to try to contribute ideas. This will develop learners' active knowledge making skills, knowledge producers instead of knowledge consumers, and they're both free to use applications, and they're very, very intuitive tasks. So task 5 is create knowledge producers using forums and mind maps. Affordance number 3, multimodal meaning. So text, image, sound, data. It's exactly what I do almost every day with multimedia. So looking at diverse forms of making meanings and different multiliteracies. So presenting in multimedia or multiple ways ensures that your students can have some key concepts reinforced along their learning journey. So the task in this section is we have dynamic elements and we have static elements. The dynamic elements, you have your videos and your animations and your audio, and your typical static elements with your Word documents and your images. So by now, we have covered many forms of dynamic elements and static elements. We are already using many multimodal approaches like video recordings and linked resources in the task that I've mentioned earlier. So for this task, I want you to try and upload an audio recording. So this could be as feedback to some kind of work. Students sometimes respond better to the audio. We have second language English learners, and when you write something down, sometimes it goes over and they may not understand this clearly, but when it's spoken to them and recorded, they link and they can really take benefit from the feedback. So use the tools that are available, like upload an audio recording. Also, encourage your students to respond with an audio recording. That could be them responding to your feedback, or they could be explaining something, or they could be describing something. So use audio for feedback and for responses as well. There's also there's many different types of multimodal applications out there. So I've just chosen a few to not overwhelm and overdo this section. So in this section, what the third task here, or the follow-on task from this, would be to encourage your learners to submit some work using one of the dynamic multimodal tools, such as Prezi and Adobe Spark. And there's several other examples that I've put on the website, but just to kind of highlight the 2 here where that uses a combination of animation. Adobe Spark is also a very current trending multimodal tool where students can create very interactive, not very interactive, but yeah, very engaging and dynamic presentations. So get your students to use the tools, encourage the use of technology, and it'll be able to express their submissions using these multimodal dynamic formats. So task number 6, create recordings and multimodal responses. Okay, so affordance number 4, recursive feedback, formative assessment. This is a way for learners to check their progress by receiving timely and relevant feedback as part of an online activity. So this could be through machine mediated, it could be through stored assessments, peer and self-assessments. So the task that we're going to look at in this case will be using scaffolding strategies. So scaffolding strategies are a really good way of giving feedback and building sort of students' formative assessment. So breaking complex tasks using scaffolding strategies helps learners close cognitive gaps. So we're going to try to look at a quiz approach, and this quiz is using interactive tools to vary your delivery and improve retention. Quizzes and Kahoot is quite popular. It's an interactive application. It's very easy to set up and engaging for your learners. So in this task, what I want you to do is to use either one of the following apps to create small recap quizzes. And these game-based blended learning application improves retention and ignites your learner's cognitive side, a bit similar to what Francesca mentioned in her presentation on a number of occasions. So this could be in the class, so synchronous, and this could be outside of the class, so asynchronous. And it's available on all different types of mobiles and iPads, and so it's a very, very easy thing to do. You can also look at building the quizzes up. So there are many different types of strategies for recursive feedback. Scaffolding, like portfolios, teaches feedback along the way, which helps them learn and make sure the competencies are met. With quizzes, what you could do is create recap quizzes so that students can see the steps and plot their progress in an organized and timely fashion. So they work at their own pace. Ultimately, students have control of their learning with the machine-mediated feedback at a pace they're happy with. Okay, so number 7, use one of the blended learning game-based tools. Number 5, collaborative intelligence, affordance number 5. So knowledge you can reach for and use, so looking at collective intelligence, the learning community, and creative co-production. So online social activities provide support and teamwork opportunities, and collaboration spaces stimulate ideas, perspectives, and also lots of food for thought. So the task number 8 we're going to look at is using collaborative tools. This synchronous and asynchronous activity encourages active learning. So the idea will be sorry? Okay, so the idea here is learners are encouraged to actively engage. A perfect tool for this is set up a group collaborative activity using Google Docs. In the diagram, you can see that there are 6 contributors working on one document, and they're all contributing some different ideas and working together. They're also able to give feedback on different parts of the work. So add feedback using comments to encourage your students to add feedback using the tools that are there. And teachers also combine the feedback together. That way you are developing learners' key critical thinking skills, and you're also improving their communication skills. And this also helps them with their decision-making skills as well. There are many different types of collaboration tools. There's so many to cover. I wanted to focus on the Google Docs and the Google sort of suite because it is available, it's free. And what's great about it is once students know how to use the sharing option on Google Docs, they can easily transfer and not have to relearn the process on other areas like Sheets, Google Slides, and Google Forms. So a really great suite to be working with and something that really helps with that collaborative teamwork approach. So collaborative intelligence, use collaborative tools and set up a Google Doc. Number 6, metacognition. Affordance number 6, thinking about thinking. So the self-awareness, the knowledge variables, and task variables. So thinking about thinking is a very valuable activity for online learners. It helps you reflect on what you have learned and where you are going. So it helps the learner to determine areas of weakness as well as strengths, and helps them to think about what questions they need to think about going forward. All right, so the task here will be to do with reflection, and we're going to try and look at using breakout groups. Breakout groups to allow learners the opportunity to discuss their thoughts with others. There are many different kinds of metacognition activities like self-assessment and surveys and quizzes and learning journals, which we will look at later. So in this activity, the group work reduces the pressure for learners to participate online. So in my experience, when you have larger groups, students generally tend to be very, very quiet. When you break that into smaller groups, students are a little bit more open and they are much more confident. Maybe this is because they have similar faces inside each group because the groups are smaller, or just the fact that they are smaller. So it increases that confidence, and they also contribute a little bit more as well. So there's different ways you can use groups, use different types. So you can set up groups for teacher and learner, where a teacher can have that one-to-one feedback, learner to learner, where learners can work together and discuss issues and successes about the work that they're doing and try and find solutions, or learner to content, where they can all work together and look at a standard model so they know that they're going to the right way. And then they can try and work out if this is the right way to go forward. So the breakout groups dynamic has many, many benefits, apart from just reflection. It also helps foster that classroom relationships towards a stronger learning community, and also identify strengths and areas for improvement for that learner. Now, importantly, as I mentioned in the synchronous session at the beginning, that environment is you constantly going over and over this environment to try and make sure that you create a connection with the student. So having them interact in smaller groups encourages them, builds their confidence, and because they know where they're going, it also improves the whole learning experience. So task affordance number 7, differentiated learning. So each according to their interest and needs. Individual learning needs, a learner-centered approach, a differentiated instruction, learners choose and set their own pace. So how can we personalize learning experience or tailor a course to a learner's needs and interest? So by now, if all the previous tasks have been completed, we've covered 9 so far, we're going to talk about the 10th one, by now you would have been able to set up several strategies and be well prepared for various forms of differentiated learning. So in this activity, task number 10, student-centered learning, we're going to look at how you can get to know your student better. So what kind of learner are they? Find out the dynamics of your class. So do they talk a lot? Are they communicators? Are they creative thinkers? Are they the caring, sensitive type? Do they like to follow the rules? Are they principled? So in this case, what I want you to do is create a learner profile survey to assess student needs using one of the online survey tools. So for example, you have Google Forms, a game, and SurveyMonkey. Both of them are free and they're easy to set up. And what I've also put here is a list of questions that you could focus on. So things like, what are their likes and dislikes that you might want to identify, their life experience, just to get personality, if they've got any potential barriers to learning, so you can identify some of these areas. So not everyone learns in the same way. So differentiated learning is more possible now than ever before because there are so many different mediums that we can look at. So now that we've discussed all these strategies and all these different types, you can tailor your course to suit your learners' needs. So this concludes my presentation. Hopefully by following the 10 tasks linked to the 7 affordances, they'll help you to run effective online pedagogy so that your learners don't miss out on any new ways of learning. You can gain access to this, as Phil has just mentioned, on the website. I've got many more examples there, and it's a little bit more detail as well. And hopefully that will give you a chance to implement some of these strategies into your own online pedagogy. Thank you very much for listening. I hope this helped.
Thank you very much, Wakil, both to you and Fran. We're now going to field it over to the Q&A section. So if you have any questions for Wakil or Fran, whether about the theory or the practical application, feel free to pop it in the chat box. We noticed that Mervet had a comment about electronic educational websites and dealing with the programs and the platforms. We'll be discussing this a bit more in tomorrow's session with how to actually use those programs inside the classroom as well. Does anybody have any other questions for our presenters? We had a few. Let me just share the screen. One moment, please. I think this question was fielded for Fran. From the 7 affordances that you discussed, which would you say is the most difficult to implement?
Good question. I would say it definitely depends on the type of learners that you're working with. For us in particular, we have ESL students, and I believe that many of you today attending the sessions are working with English language learners or students learning English. And so if your students are at a lower proficiency level, I would say it's much harder to encourage that peer assessment because they're not really at a level in which they can give each other feedback and assess each other. So I would say it depends on your learners, but if you have lower proficiency students, then it's difficult to encourage that peer assessment.
And have you seen any changes in the learners since implementing the 7 affordances?
Definitely. I would say that it's a process. So when you kind of give your students this freedom and this autonomy and expect them to complete things independently, at first they don't know how to react. They're not used to it. They're a little more used to being spoon-fed things step by step. And so it's a learning process. Once they get more comfortable with navigating online and completing tasks independently, then they become independent learners and they go off and do things on their own and they just check in with you for certain things, but they become very independent. So it's really great to witness as a teacher.
Thank you very much, Fran, for your input. And I believe we had a few questions for Wakil as well. Out of the 10 tasks that you mentioned, which tasks would you prioritize?
Great question as well. So, I mean, a lot of them, they're all useful. But I would probably, if I was to choose the tasks that I would definitely prioritize, I would probably look at the synchronous sessions where you have an online face-to-face link with your students. That link builds that and fosters a relationship with the student, regardless of whether they're whatever level their level is at. So that I would say the first thing I would probably put is that creating a synchronous session using Zoom or using Google Meet to ensure that they have that FaceTime and that timetable link. That would be task number 1. And also alongside that is the 2 of the tasks that are linked to that, which were the recorded sessions, so they can access that information afterwards, and also the downloadable side. So I would say that synchronous, asynchronous session would be the one that I would definitely prioritize.
And are there any free systems that teachers can use?
So yeah, so at the moment with Zoom, there's a limit on how much you can actually, how many students you can have, and then again, how long that duration is. So there's plenty of different types of things, like there's the FaceTime on Apple. You can have a link with students using that. There's also your WhatsApp FaceTime, and you have Skype, which are all free platforms where you can have that one-to-one session. Now, accompanying that way to record your work or to record that session, you would use applications like, if you're on Apple, a QuickTime application to record your screen, or Screen-O-Matic, which is an online platform. All of these things that I'm talking about, they're on the website. If you want, I can just quickly show you. Well, actually, I think we'll have a look at that in a short while. But on the website, you'll see all these applications that I'm talking about, just in case they're going over your head. The idea of...
We'll post the link to the website shortly, yeah, definitely.
Okay, cool.
So thank you very much for that, Wakil. We're now going to move over to the second portion of today's session with Richard.
Lana, just to interrupt you, there was one question on Facebook that came through.
Oh, sorry about that.
But I think we mentioned it, that the question was where can they get access to the slides or the documents that are being presented? Well, these are all on the website, as we mentioned at the start. Everything that you see today and tomorrow, all the activities, all the presentations are on the website that we will share with you, and you can take some time to go through it in depth. Clearly, we don't have enough time to go into depth of every single section. That's why we're going through it quite quickly, but we will provide all of these for you. Okay, thanks, Lana.
Thank you very much for that as well. And now we're going to turn the session over to Richard Naish as he discusses the constraints and considerations towards e-learning. Richard, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Lana, and thank you to the audience. Good evening. I know you must be tired. If, like me, you've been teaching all day, I can understand. This session, we're going to look a little bit at a different perspective from Fran and Wakil, because Fran and Wakil, they painted this great picture about how e-learning should work. And I'm going to look at it. I agree with everything they said. E-learning is a fantastic tool, but I think we also have to look at our environment and say that some of it we're not quite ready to do the perfect implementation. I saw there were some questions on Facebook about how to deal with parents and how to deal with distractions. I think they're very good questions because they address some of the problems we're having. So before I start, just whilst I'm talking, if you have any comments or if you have anything you agree with, please give me a thumbs up in the chat box, a smile in the chat box. I know sometimes when we teach online, our students are silent. It's nice to know that you're listening and just give me some kind of reaction. It will make me feel good, and I will try to address any questions. So, like I said, Fran and Wakil, they told us about online learning, and they told us how it's a very, very powerful tool. And completely, I agree with this, okay? The problem is the people that are doing online learning perfectly have been doing online learning for 10 to 15 years. On the picture on your screen, they're the guy on the right. Most of us, we were thrown into online learning with very little preparation. And 6 months ago when we started, we were brand new. We didn't know about online learning. We didn't know how to implement it. So hopefully today and tomorrow with our sessions, we can give you some tips, we can give you some advice, and we can help you implement it. Before we get to those tips, I think we have to address what are some of the problems we're facing, what are some of the hurdles we overcome, or what are some of our constraints or our barriers. So I've been speaking to co-workers in many different countries. If you were listening to Phil at the beginning, I think he told you I've worked in Japan, Malaysia, New Zealand, Australia, England, and the UAE. And every teacher I speak to in these countries, we all face similar problems. So from talking to these students, from these teachers, I've just condensed them into 7 problems that I'm going to go through a little bit quickly. Unfortunately, I can't solve all these problems in 10 minutes, but I will try and give you some advice as we go. So the first problem some of my colleagues complained about is the learning platform. Now, from my experience, I was very lucky, and all of us at Adveti, we had a learning platform that was wonderful for e-learning. it had video conferencing, it had quizzes, it had forums. Everything we need was on this platform. Other teachers I know, they had almost nothing, okay? And it was very, very difficult for them to adapt. My advice for this is when you're planning your lessons, when you're looking at your lessons, try to think about the limitations of your platform, what you can do with it and what you can't do with it. And of course, you have to stay within that limitation. Wakil mentioned Google Classrooms, Wakil mentioned Blackboard and Zoom. My advice, analyze your platform, use it effectively, but understand that it has limitations. The second constraint or the second hurdle that teachers told me about was the contact hours. And this relates to what Francesca was saying about ubiquitous learning. Learning anytime, anywhere. I study online at the moment and I have 1 contact hour per week. My students study online at the moment and they have 30 contact hours per week. There's a whole spectrum when it comes to contact hours. We have to try and find the balance between synchronous and asynchronous. We have to make the most of the hours we have with the students, but we also have to make the most of their free time. A lot of my students at the moment are stuck at home because of the COVID pandemic, very, very bored. And for me as a teacher, this is a great time to exploit that boredom and get them to do homework and projects and fun activities. So I think this is a great time to take learning outside of the classroom, to take it asynchronously and make the most of that boredom that they feel, but also take some of the pressure of the synchronous sessions. Okay, the rest of the constraints I think are the big ones that everybody complains about. Interaction patterns. I'm sure you've all had online classes that have been very silent. The students haven't been commenting. You don't know sometimes if the students are awake or asleep. I know some of you, if you teach young learners, you have the exact opposite problem and you can't control the interactions and there's just talking and noise. We will think about this a little bit tomorrow when we talk about classroom management. Pete will talk about it a little bit later when he talks about planning your lessons. We have to plan the interaction, and we have to plan the interaction based upon the environment that we are teaching in, based on our online environment. Okay. Again, the next one was mentioned by Francesca for feedback, and we also talk about this tomorrow, so I'm just going to give it a short mention. Giving feedback online is quite difficult. I can give email feedback, I can give WhatsApp feedback, but it's not very instant and the students don't respond to it particularly quickly. Fran mentioned peer feedback, which is fantastic. If the students are trained to do it properly, peer feedback can be a very valuable tool. And Wakil mentioned audio and video feedback, which again, I find if I send students an email about their work, I don't get a response. If I send them a voice note about their work, they'll send a voice note back with 10 questions and they will engage with the feedback and then they will learn from their mistakes, which is the whole purpose of feedback anyway. So giving feedback is something we have to address when we plan our lessons, when we plan our activities. We have to plan our feedback as well. We have to plan activities that can be easily fed back. And again, Pete is going to talk about lesson planning later, so I don't want to steal all of his points. Constraint number 5, I will mention just for 10 seconds. Organizational constraints are the constraints put upon you by your organization. We have no control over these. There's nothing we can do about them, but we do have to be aware of them, because what our company wants in the end is what we will deliver. So we should plan our lesson, we should plan our teaching around the organizational constraints. So I went very quickly through the first 5 because the last 2 are the biggest and, in my opinion, the most important ones. The biggest thing we need to consider are our learners, okay? And somebody on the Facebook chat spoke about the parents. And yes, we have to consider the environment that our students are in. Do they have 6 brothers and 6 sisters all studying online at the same time? Are they parents themselves and their children are studying and they're studying simultaneously? Do our students know how to use the technology? How do we teach them to use the technology? There's so many things we need to consider about our audience, about our learners. And again, I hate to tease you, but it's coming in the next couple of sessions. We will talk about learners and how to get them familiar with e-learning. Okay. And my final constraint is one that I think will change e-learning and change our teaching more than anything. And this is about our perception. There's lots of different perceptions in play. Somebody mentioned parents. The way parents think students learn comes into play. Some parents are not accepting e-learning. They think learning is sitting in a classroom for 6 hours. Our students also have a perception, how they think they learn. And again, some of them, they think they learn through doing quizzes, writing essays. When you try and do this multimodal learning that Fran and Wakil were talking about, sometimes students don't see the benefit instantly. So we have to change their perception. Another perception that I think needs to change is teachers' perceptions. And this relates to me 6 months ago. 6 months ago, when I started teaching online, my idea was to take the physical classroom and put it online. And that just didn't work. That was setting myself up for failure. It's like putting a square peg in a round hole. The physical classroom, the things we do in the physical classroom do not fit in the environment. And so, as horrible as it is, I am not somebody that changes quickly. I'm very stubborn. Any of the co-presenters that will agree with me on that. But we have to change the way we teach. We have to change the way we think about teaching. And we have to try to teach in this new way, because it looks like COVID is going to be here for a while. It looks like we're going to be teaching online for a while. So we need to adapt, and we need to evolve, and we need to change our perspective. So I know that was quick, and I know that was a lot of points to take in, but the summary of this would be, for e-learning to work, the first thing we need to do is analyze our environment. We have to see the hurdles, see the barriers, and then we have to learn, or we have to change our perception to either go over the hurdles or around the hurdles. And throughout this session today and tomorrow, we're going to look at lesson planning, how we can plan our lessons to make e-learning effective. Essentially, how we can get rid of some of these barriers. We're going to talk about different models of teaching. We're going to talk about different tools for teaching. And we're going to talk about classroom management. And hopefully all of the advice we give you will help, if not remove the barriers, if not remove the hurdles, make them a little bit lower, so that when you go away in a few days' time, you're going to feel better about teaching online, and hopefully you're going to have something to take with you to implement in your class. So thank you very much for listening. I think Lana or Pete will be coming back with you shortly. If you have any questions, post them in Facebook, post them on the chat room in the chat box, and I will try to respond. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. Yes, and it's good to have this reality check. It's not always easy, especially if we're in that very early stage where we're thrown in without any previous experience. But thank you for alerting us to a very important aspect. We have to analyze the situation that we're in, and even for the audience out there, there are already questions coming in. What about my situation, my scenario? Everybody's situation will be different, so they do have to analyze what barriers that they have and how they can overcome.
Thank you, Phil.
Right, so let's move on. We have about 20 minutes left of this of the workshop for today. So I'm going to introduce Pete, who's going to take us through learning objectives and the start of staging a lesson. So over to you, Pete.
Hello, I think, is my audio on? Yes. Thank you, Richard. My name is Peter. I'm going to steer this ship home for the first day of the course. Thank you everyone for paying attention for the course so far. This last section will take about 15 minutes, leaving a little time just for Q&A at the end. In my presentation, I'm just going to share the screen quickly. In my presentation, we're going to talk about learning objectives in an online class and then lesson staging in an online class. The reason I chose these topics is because I'm a department manager. So during this online learning, I've been, like Richard said, there's been a lot of barriers, a lot of frustrations from students, from teachers, from managers, from parents. And my role has been to respond quite quickly and deal with the problems and to encourage people to share the best practices they've got. So in this section, we'll be talking about the ABCD of learning objectives, adapting to learning objectives for online learning. I'm going to share little tools as we go along that I've seen being used. This is called a sticky, and it's something that goes on top of your screen like a sticky note. It comes free with Windows if you use it, and I've seen this used to signpost lesson of the learn objectives as it's been going on. So I'm just going to drag it down the bottom right now, but it is something I might refer to later. So first of all, we're going to talk about learning objectives, just as a nice fun introduction. Picture from Lord of the Rings. What was the objective here? I made this picture using Ribbit, by the way. That's a nice tool for photos. We won't do the interaction here in this workshop, but I put this on a Padlet, which is a pin board for people to put ideas. I put this out to my colleagues and asked for their feedback, and they put things like this. Frodo's objective was to fight a dragon, I think that's the wrong film, to be honest. Throw the ring in the fire, that's the right objective. Beat a monster, there was, heroes, you can put audio on Padlet to meet this guy, a few fun things. So this is what the objective of that film was. What is a learning objective? This is something I see very frequently. The learning objective is for a language class, present simple, and do page 14 in the book. For me, this isn't a learning objective. This is a record of what you're doing. I would define a learning objective as a goal that should be achieved by a student at the end of the lesson or the course, and the knowledge and skills we want our students to learn from the lesson. What can your students do after a lesson that they couldn't do before? This is key to writing a learning objective. So a tip I've found is called the ABCD of writing learning objectives. The A is the audience. Who are you teaching? What level are they? And what learning styles do they have? The B is the behavior. What action do you want your students to do? And for this, you would use Bloom's taxonomy. I'll come back to that in a second. C is the content. What is the subject of the lesson? What's the learning point, the vocabulary, or the grammar, or the skill, if it's a language class? And D, the degree. How much do you want them to actually achieve in this lesson? So again, this is a poster I made for the ABCDs. I used Canva. I've been using this every single day during the online learning. So using this model, ABCD of writing and learning objectives, here's a physical example. Year 10 girls will be able to run 100 meters in under 20 seconds. The audience is our year 10 girls. We want them to run. That's the action I want them to do. 100 meters is how far I want them to run, and in under 20 seconds is how fast I want them to run. So applying that, that's a PE example, but this is designed for language teachers. So here's an example of a more language-based learning objective. Level 1 students will be able to write 4 sentences about their daily routines using the present simple. So we have the audience, the level 1 students, we have the action I want them to write, we have the content, it's the present simple I want them to focus on, and 4 sentences is how much I want them to write. Just to come back to the behavior, looking at the B, which is the right here. Bloom's taxonomy, this would take a whole other presentation, but I'm just going to cross it here a little bit. You need to be using these for the verbs that you're writing in your learning objectives. I'm putting a few examples on the board, on the screen. These are going to be shared on the website, but it's something you should read into and get used to when you're writing. It really helps for putting together an effective learning objective. Now, what I've just covered is applicable in traditional classrooms. So I was trying to think now, how do I apply this to online learning? And what I've observed during this last 6 months of intense online observing is that setting micro learning objectives is important. There are so many distractions. Screen fatigue is an issue. There might be technical issues. So you need to set small objectives so that no matter what happens, something is achieved in that lesson. If you rely on an hour-long objective, it might not get fully achieved. You need to adapt the verb for online learning. So when we talked about Bloom's taxonomy, you need to think, well, what is specific to online learning? Things like research, posting things, creating. These are online verbs. Think of the 21st century learning skills. The parents issue that was raised in the chat box is something that it comes up. We weren't taught the same way. You know, we're at a certain age. We weren't faced with these obstacles that our students were. They're going to be facing a very different world when they leave school and get into the workplace. And we need to think about these skills that they'll need. They'll need leadership. They'll need communication skills. They'll need critical thinking. And a few other things. Show the learning objective as a signpost. So I kept this sticky down below. I'd bring it up to say, well, so far we've covered this. We're now looking at this, just to show the learners where they are in the lesson. Focusing on a lesson for a significant amount of time online is challenging. So keep the learning objective as a signpost. Ask your students about the learning. At the end of the class, give them a poll. Ask them, did they learn anything here? Give them a Likert scale 1 to 5. Did they take on board anything? And if they didn't, you might need to revisit that in a later class. And for asynchronous learning, which Wax and Fran talked about, you need to be setting learning objectives that might need to be achieved by an absent student or someone who's studying in the evening or at the weekend or something. You might need to consider how your learning objectives are flexible for students who aren't in the classroom at the time. So here's an example of a learning objective for online learning using those tips I just provided. So I've extended it to 3 periods. Level 1 students will be able to survey their classmates about daily routines during coronavirus lockdown, post a 50-word summary on social media about changes in daily routine using the present simple, and create a class Padlet to show changes in daily routine during the coronavirus lockdown. Now, this is longer to write, but it covers 3 periods, but it's more or less the same achievement as what we had in the traditional class. We've still got the audience. We've got different objectives, action verbs, which are in Bloom's taxonomy, but they're very much related to online learning. We still have the present simple as the content. And the amount we want them to write is a 50-word summary. We don't write individual sentences when we're online. We write posts of 50 words and things like this. So this is how I would adapt a learning objective for online learning. So just to signpost where we are now, we've covered the first two objectives of this section of the workshop, and we're going to move now into lesson staging in an online class. So one thing the reason I wanted to cover this is because classes are moving very quickly, and the traditional staging of an online class the traditional staging needs to be adapted to suit online learning, because they're not in the same mold anymore. The dynamics of the classroom have changed now that we're in an online class. So I surveyed my teachers using something called Mentimeter. I put the different stages of a lesson, and Mentimeter is a really good way to survey people quickly. And they came up with the most important stages are the presentation stage, the production stage, and the practice of the language point. So that's what I would like to look at. I'm going to look at a few tools. So for the presentation stage, this is where you brainstorm what the students know, their prior knowledge. You would present the language to them, and you might model and scaffold it for them. The tools I have seen being used effectively. Obviously, there are many more, but I just wanted to cross a few of them. I've put a lot here. I'm not going to go into depth on each one of them. I've already used in this presentation Padlet. We're talking on Zoom. I showed us Mentimeter and Canva. So you've seen examples of how these work. If you want to try to use them, I would advise learning yourself by going to YouTube or just Googling it to find out which ones are the most effective and most useful for you. Someone mentioned in the chat box, what about the cost? All of these are free. There are paid versions of each one, I would say, to try and make it without adverts and things like that. But generally speaking, they're all free, and I haven't really had to dip into my pockets to increase my tools for this. I will just cross into to talk about 2 or 3. Insert Learning is a great tool for reading and asking questions to connections with reading. So you would put a text into Insert Learning, and as the student progressed through the reading text, a question would pop up on the screen, and you would set yourself. So this is really good to personalize the learning, to scaffold it so that they're developing the understanding of the language point from the step by step as you do it. This could be achieved asynchronously and synchronously in the classroom. Screencast-O-Matic. I actually did a whole other PD on this that's on my YouTube that I can share on our website. But Screencast is a free video making tool that all you need is a computer and a phone with a microphone, and you can make any presentation you want. So for your students, I'll come to staging in a minute, but this is really effective for flipped learning if you want to present the language for the class. And on that point, Flipgrid is a website that I've seen a little better than YouTube. YouTube is obviously a fantastic resource, and you can create your own YouTube channel, but Flipgrid allows you to post a video and for students to post their own audios and videos, a bit like the Padlet I showed before, but you can use Flipgrid so that you could put a little video on encouraging them to discuss, and then that could be their homework for the evening, and then they come back the next day and you use the classroom time effectively to practice the language. Flipgrid is a great tool. The practice section, applying learning in fixed activities where you're getting them. This would be where inside the classroom. There's many that I'm seeing. I'm just going to focus on Quizlet. Quizlet is a great tool for creating your own questions. You can do as many questions as you want. A, B, C, Ds, gap fills, drag and drops, and all the students need is a device that they can access and answer the questions. It makes it very competitive. It shows students where they made the errors and how they can, and it uses some AI to build it so that the students get challenged at the ones they made the mistakes on. It's a very clever tool. Production stage of the lesson. Admittedly, this is the stage of the lesson that many teachers, are moving out of their lessons because they just don't have time, and it's hard to get students to interact. But there are tools you can use to get them to interact in some way. we've used a Weebly for our website. I didn't know it really, to be honest, before our team got together, but I used Wix. But Weebly is a great website for putting, for creating a website that shows all the language you can produce. And if you put it together day by day, week by week of what your students could produce, they have something tangible that they can say they put together. WhatsApp, different countries are using different things, Facebook Messenger and what have you, but WhatsApp is being used very effectively for building rapport. One thing we've lost in the class without the classroom is the rapport, and WhatsApp is a good way to share audio and writing of language production. Now, the final part of this section is to do with alternative staging for an online class. We've just covered PPP, which is the common way that most people have been delivering classes. And of course, there are other teaching methodologies, task-based learning, but I'm going to introduce one called Engage, Study, Activate, which was first mainly published by Jeremy Harmer in 2008, but it's a very good way of staging which brings in all different teaching methodologies. It suits the flexibility needed for online learning, and it introduces flipped classroom options that can reduce the class time and increase the autonomy that our learners need. So Engage, this would need a lot of explanation, but Engage is games, stories, anecdotes to focus on the target language. Get the students interested in what you're teaching them. Study, this is where you present the target language and you practice the target language. And Activate is where you get the students to do a task. The idea is not just filling in worksheets, not just answering questions, actually using the target language. And here you can personalize and differentiate the learning. So the standard sequence, a bit like PPP, would be Engage, Study, Activate. It makes sense. You read a story, you focus on the language, you get them to write the story, something like that. But for online learning, we might need to consider different teaching sequences. And this is where Engage, Study, Activate is flexible. So you might start with the Engage, a story. Then you would get them to write their story, but you go back to study the language point so they can correct their own story. You might, this example would be flipped classroom. So they study at home using a video that you've created, a 2-minute presentation. You engage them in the class into the same topic, and you get them to produce the language. You activate it. And then there's many different ways. You might engage, go to activate, back to study, back to engage, if you've got micro learning objectives like I talked about before. You need to think about what you want to achieve in this lesson, what can be done independently, how you can maintain engagement. So consider these things. Consider the learning objectives you write and how you stage your lesson. And you might be able to encourage more activity in your language classroom. This is the end of the first day. We're going to open for some questions now, but I just wanted to make sure that everyone is aware of our website. We've shared it in the chat boxes, so please take a look. And everything we've talked about today from Fran and Wax and Richard and myself is all contained on this website. Okay, it's now 7:30, so we will open for a few questions to complete the day, if anyone has any.
So we had a few questions that came to us in the chat box. I know Fran addressed one of them, but if we wanted to open it up for discussion, just very briefly. Oops, sorry, let me just quickly, there we go. So the first question was how to deal with distractions. So if any of our speakers would like to give our listeners some advice on how to deal with distractions inside the classroom.
I'm waiting for Pete to answer.
I know personally, myself speaking personally, for me, it's all about anticipation. The more I anticipate and prepare and think about maybe future problems I'll have inside the classroom, whether it's with the actual lesson itself or maybe even troubleshooting and technology issues, if I know the students are going to struggle with downloading a program or digitally completing an assignment, I try to anticipate those questions beforehand.
I have had lots of phone calls. I've been manning the helpline for my campus, and students were phoning non-stop at the start for little things, and most of the time wasted repeating myself. So I use screencast to just record how it's done, share it with them, make it clear, put something visual, and then they watch it again and again. And that seemed to help with the distractions, which were the technical based ones.
Can I add a point on the distractions? I think a really important thing with this is when I was saying about changing perspective and when these guys were talking about ubiquitous learning, if we think about education has to happen in that moment in the classroom, then there will be distractions. But if we think that the learning can happen at any time of the day, the more we get this asynchronous idea into our heads, the student can study when there are no distractions. Some of my students are mothers and they are constantly distracted by their children, as I'm sure everyone with children out there will agree. And the way for them to study is, okay, when I'm in the synchronous session, sometimes they're distracted, but through videos, through asynchronous learning, through different approaches and embracing e-learning, they can still learn despite the distraction.
Can I add also to that?
Okay, yeah. Can we don't have very much time, but can we move on to the other couple of questions?
Yeah, I think Fran started to address the second question. So Fran, if you would like to explain this a bit more, how to deal with parents' rejection of e-learning.
I think a lot of times they're rejecting this process because they're not comfortable with it. They're not used to it themselves. And so something that really helps with both the learners and the parents is giving them everything through video so that they can really visually see. This goes back to that multimodal learning, but so they can visually see the steps instead of giving them a list of written instructions, letting them see what's happening step by step so that they can replicate those steps and they don't feel so lost and out of their depth. So I think that's something really helpful. And just giving them, routine, establishing routine with them so that they get used to this form of learning.
Thank you very much for that, Fran. And then our final question was, a lot of schools perhaps can't afford to buy these technologies. So how can we address those challenges?
So I'll try and attempt to answer this because it's quite a difficult one to get right. But just looking at the e-learning tools themselves, there's many institutes and students also who don't have the resources to buy this kind of equipment. And especially maybe the platforms, they always have a little catch about this is free and then there's a limit on how much you can do. So it would probably come down to trying to combine some of the tools that have been expressed in the discussions today and shown today, and combining them with the 7 affordance strategies in the most effective way. So for example, with Google, you have lots of different interactive tools, and with Screenomatic, so creating these asynchronous sessions and uploading them to a free cloud-based drive. So trying to be clever and creative with some of the free platforms, some of the free resources that are out there, just to get around that cost will be one way to try and create an area or a platform or a location for students to access that sort of learning content. And with regards to the actual equipment and so on, that's always going to be a challenge for a school, but in most cases, if the focus is trying to create that asynchronous session for mobile phones at that level, then they can then make probably the best effective benefit using the strategies that we've discussed.
Yeah, I would agree with Wakil there. It is worth saying that e-learning is very, very difficult to implement without devices. They will need something. And depending on your country and your situation, I know in some countries there's government support for this. Maybe there's community businesses that will help schools out. But without a device, I mean, I think the most minimal e-learning would be teaching through just WhatsApp and a couple of videos you make and a couple of tools. So just WhatsApp and just email, you can still implement a lot of this e-learning. You will just lose the synchronous side. But if you add some of the tools Wakil was talking about as well, it will be a challenge. If there's infrastructure problems and internet problems and lack of devices, I don't envy you. It will be a challenge, but hopefully you can get some support from somewhere.
Thank you very much to all of our speakers, and thank you for all of you for joining us today. I'm going to turn the presentation over to Philip Milton for some final word. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, thanks, Lana, and thanks the panel for their presentations for the first part of this two-day workshop, and to the audience on the Zoom and following on the Facebook. We will continue tomorrow with another 1.5 hour session, and tomorrow we will hear from Marsha and Lana and Richard and Pete, I think, is back again tomorrow. So we continue with the theme of effective online delivery, and as the presenters have said to you all the way along, everything that they prepared is on their website for you to have a closer look at. To conclude this evening, thank you very much everybody for joining us. I hope you've got something out of this, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. So I'll hand it over to Mariam or to Moza to wrap up from the Educated Without Borders team.
Yes, Mr. Philip, let me please thank you so much. And let me please thank the team for this amazing and interesting presentation. Thank you all for attending the Effective Online Delivery Workshop. We really appreciate your support. Your participation means a lot for us. I hope that we provided you an effective and useful material during this current situation. Finally, let me please remind you that this workshop will have a second part that will be broadcast tomorrow at the same time at 6 o'clock UAE time. Thank you so much and have a nice evening.